It was supposed to be impossible. Cold water, tight cells, guards with rifles. Nobody beat Alcatraz until three men vanished into the night in 1962.
Immediately, this creates chaos. These prisoners are gone. How could these prisoners have escaped this super security prison?
For decades, the world believed they drowned. Now, scientists finally proved what really happened. And the truth isn't just shocking, it changes everything.
They crawled out of their cells up on the roof and escaped into the San Francisco Bay, and that, you got to give it to them. They broke the system.
Imagine a place where silence is punishment, and time stretches like the fog rolling over the San Francisco Bay. A slab of rock surrounded by freezing, unforgiving water, where the American justice system sent not just its criminals, but its outcasts. Alcatraz wasn't just a prison, it was the last page in a man's story. Officially opened in 1934, the Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was America's iron-fisted answer to rising organized crime. With mobsters like Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, and Alvin Creepy Karpis on the roster, the island was painted as unbreachable, and its walls were said to be more certain than death. Not one successful escape, not one confirmed survivor. That was the myth. The message was clear. If you were sent to Alcatraz, society had already made peace with never seeing you again. But underneath the concrete, the system cracked. The prison was meticulously designed to destroy hope. Prisoners were counted 13 times a day, and even conversations during meals had to be earned. The cells were barely wider than the length of your arms. Even the architecture was psychological warfare. The mess hall had tear gas canisters installed in the ceiling, ready to drop at the first sign of unrest. Guards perched above in glass-shielded towers with loaded rifles trained downward. Even the stairwells weren't safe. There was no escape, and more importantly, there was no imagination of escape. The water surrounding the island was as much a guard as the men with guns. Between 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit on average, the currents were brutal and fast. They didn't need to shoot you if you tried to run. The bay would swallow you whole. The myth of the rock was complete, and it worked. For nearly 3 decades, Alcatraz had 0 confirmed escapes. 14 attempts were made. All of them failed. Men were either caught, killed, or vanished with the assumption they drowned. The prison wasn't perfect, but the narrative was bulletproof. Still, beneath all this power and precision, something darker was building. Not in the institution itself, but within the cracks it refused to see. Because prisons, even the most secure, still rely on one faulty variable: people. People make decisions. People get lazy. People overlook things. And one day, 3 men would prove that no fortress is unbreakable, just temporarily undefeated. He didn't talk much. Frank Morris was one of those people who seemed to be observing a little more than everyone else. Not paranoid, just calculating. If you looked into his eyes, you wouldn't see fear. You'd see a blueprint. Morris arrived at Alcatraz in January 1960, transferred from the Louisiana State Penitentiary after yet another failed escape attempt. It wasn't his first, it wouldn't be his last. In fact, that's what made Morris different. He wasn't violent, unhinged, or theatrical. He was a puzzle solver in a place built like a locked box. Frank Morris had been abandoned by his parents at the age of 11. Raised in the state system, he learned early that if he didn't outthink the world, it would crush him. By 13, he was already in trouble with the law. By his 20s, he'd been incarcerated in Florida, Georgia, and Louisiana. Every time he was locked up, he saw it as a challenge, not a sentence. Escape wasn't an act of defiance. It was a test. When he landed in Alcatraz, the staff assumed the rock would finally break him. But what they didn't realize was that they had just handed a lifelong tactician the ultimate puzzle box, and all the time in the world to solve it. Frank wasn't alone. His cell was wedged between 2 brothers, John and Clarence Anglin, lean, quiet, Southern-born bank robbers from a family of 13 children. They'd grown up poor, picking fruit in the fields of Florida and Michigan. Like Morris, they were familiar with systems: how to get through one, how to bend one, how to hide within one. And just a few cells away, Alan West, another escape-minded inmate who had also done time with Morris before. They'd all crossed paths in earlier prisons. This wasn't a random gathering. It was an unofficial reunion of outcasts with a common goal. Slowly, whispers turned into planning, not in loud declarations or scribbled diagrams. This was built piece by piece, glance by glance. They studied the guards' movements, Listened to when footsteps echoed louder. Noticed which pipes vibrated, which concrete had salt damage, and what the prison forgot to maintain. The cracks in the institution weren't just physical, they were psychological. Routine breeds laziness, familiarity blinds, and Morris knew it. Over time, a hierarchy formed. Morris wasn't just the smartest of the group, he was the leader, the mastermind, the one who saw the path even if it hadn't been carved yet. Their plan? Not just escape, disappear, without a trace. They had no map, no promise of land on the other side of that icy water, no second chances. But they had each other, they had time, and they had an idea so audacious, so precise that the prison wouldn't even realize it had been beaten until the sun came up. What they were about to attempt wasn't just a jailbreak, it was an erasure. In most prisons, an escape begins with breaking something. A door, a lock, a rule. But the escape from Alcatraz began with a silence. No alarms, no confrontations, just the soft grind of metal spoons against concrete, night after night. Behind the sink in each of their cells sat a small ventilation grill. To most inmates, it was just part of the wall, another reminder of the world they'd never reach. But Morris saw something different. The concrete around it was crumbling. Saltwater air had eaten into the infrastructure. That wasn't just decay, it was a doorway. Using metal spoons stolen from the mess hall and broken saw blades scavenged from workshops, the crew began chipping away at the walls behind their sinks. The work was slow, surgical. Morris understood one critical truth. Escaping wasn't about force, it was about rhythm. Each night, while others slept or read, he would play his accordion during music hour, the wheezing, off-key sound masking the scrape of blades against stone. It was crude camouflage, but in a prison where guards stopped hearing things they didn't want to investigate, it worked perfectly. Every fragment of concrete had to be collected, hidden, or flushed. Every tool had to be returned before morning count. It took months to burrow the escape tunnels wide enough to crawl through. But the tunnel was only one part of the act. The illusion was just as important. The escapees crafted life-size dummy heads to leave in their beds, heads that needed to fool not just the guards, but the routine itself. They were sculpted from soap, cement dust, toilet paper, and paint stolen from the art shop. The finishing touch? Real human hair. Swept from the barbershop floor, smuggled back in pockets, and glued onto the heads with care. These were not Halloween props. These were stand-ins for a lie. When the guards made their usual flashlight passes at night, they didn't tap the bars. They didn't shout. They just looked for the shape of a head, a hint of skin. The dummies would pass. Meanwhile, above their cells in a disused service corridor, the men created a secret workshop. Hidden from guards, this narrow passageway became the heart of the escape, a place where they stored tools, stitched gear, and assembled their greatest creation, a homemade inflatable raft. Constructed from over 50 raincoats, stolen, bartered, or repurposed, the raft was hand-stitched using thread from the prison factory. The seams were sealed using heat from steam pipes, melting rubber into makeshift waterproof barriers. As for inflation, they converted a concertina into an air pump. Ingenious, quiet, functional. They even carved homemade paddles from bits of plywood. Every single item needed for escape was either smuggled, stolen, or constructed from prison scraps. This wasn't an escape built on brute strength. It was an engineering marvel, hidden in plain sight. And yet perhaps the boldest part of the plan wasn't the digging, the dummies, or the raft. It was timing. The men knew the tides. They studied them, watched the bay from the small slit of window they had. The plan had to be executed during a narrow tidal window, when the currents would drift toward Angel Island instead of pulling them into the Pacific. One false move, and the water would erase them before they were ever missed. Everything, every step, every disguise, every measurement was rehearsed. The only variable left was whether the rock was paying attention. Alan West had every reason to believe he'd be free by sunrise. He'd dug just like the others, chipped concrete, hid debris, whispered through cell walls. He'd helped build the raft, stitch the raincoats, and sculpt the dummy heads. He knew the escape plan, every inch of it, but when it finally came time to execute, West faced something no blueprint could fix. He couldn't get out. The concrete wall behind his sink, the very tunnel he'd spent months chipping away at, had narrowed too sharply. Maybe he'd miscalculated, maybe he'd gotten lazy, but now, with the others moving, climbing, and escaping above him, West was on his knees, scraping furiously at a hole that had become his coffin. He could hear the others already crawling through. Time was draining like water from a cracked glass. He wedged himself into the hole, pushed, twisted, and still couldn't fit. His breath quickened. His tools felt useless in his hands. The rock, so close to being conquered, was about to crush him alone. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers waited for a while, but they couldn't risk it. Dawn was creeping closer, and the longer they lingered, the higher the chance a noise or a shadow would give them away. They had no choice. They left him. West watched them go, heard the last echoes of feet above the corridor, then silence. No heroic promises, no parting words, just absence. When the morning count came, West didn't run. He didn't try to fake his way out. Instead, he confessed. Guards found him in his cell, the dummy head still on his pillow, the real man sitting silently nearby. What he gave them next wasn't just information, it was the entire anatomy of the greatest prison escape attempt in American history. He told them about the vent tunnels, the raft, the air pump, the fake heads, and the plan to hit Angel Island. Without Allen West, much of what we know today about the escape might have been buried under concrete forever. Some say West was bitter. Others claim he tried to rewrite his story in interviews to sound less like a failure. But one detail always lingered, and it changed everything. When asked if the escapees had mentioned a plan B in case he didn't make it, West hesitated, and then said something strange. They might have changed course if they knew I'd talk. The implication? The escape route may have shifted mid-plan to avoid capture if West was compromised. That means everything, from where they landed to what they did next, could have diverged from what the authorities searched for. West's mistake sealed his fate. He remained behind bars, processed again when Alcatraz finally closed its doors in 1963. In the eyes of the law, he became the ultimate witness. In the eyes of the public, the man who could have made it, but didn't. History forgot Allen West, but without him, the legend may never have existed. It arrived quietly, like most legends do, not in a flash of headlines, but in the stillness of a dusty envelope postmarked from nowhere. San Francisco Police, 2013. Inside, a handwritten note. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962. Yes, we all made it that night, but barely. John Anglin. The handwriting was shaky. The ink was slightly smudged, but the words hit like dynamite. After 5 decades of silence, someone, maybe one of the ghosts of that night, was ready to talk. John claimed Frank Morris died in 2005, Clarence in 2008, and that he, John, was dying of cancer. He offered a deal. If authorities promised medical treatment, he'd turn himself in. The tone wasn't defiant or theatrical. It sounded tired, like a man who had outrun everything but time. The FBI quietly launched an investigation. They ran DNA tests, handwriting analysis, and cross-referenced fingerprints with 1962 records. The result? Inconclusive. Not a yes, not a no. Just enough to fan the flames. The public didn't even know the letter existed until 2018, when a CBS affiliate broke the story. Suddenly, the legend came roaring back. Reddit lit up. News anchors dusted off cold footage. Theories multiplied. The Anglin family had long insisted that brothers were alive. They believed the letter was genuine, the handwriting familiar. They'd even claimed the boys made a fearful call home in the 1970s. It wasn't proof, but it was hard to ignore. The letter ended with one last line. If you announce on TV that I'll be promised medical help, I'll write back and tell you where I am. He never wrote again. In a dusty photo album in rural Florida, tucked between decades-old family snapshots, sat a single sun-bleached photograph that could rewrite history. Taken in 1975, it showed 2 men, tan, weathered, standing beside a roadside shack in Brazil. No names, no timestamp, just tired eyes and an uncanny resemblance to John and Clarence Anglin. The family handed it over to the authorities. No wild claims, no demands, just, we believe this is them. Facial recognition software, run decades later, found compelling similarities in bone structure, spacing, and jawlines. Not a guarantee, but enough to raise eyebrows even in skeptical rooms. There was more. According to the family, they'd received unsigned Christmas cards for years, postmarked vaguely from overseas. Short notes, thinking of you always. Warm wishes from us both. The FBI confiscated the cards in the 1970s. Never returned, never verified. And then came the most bizarre claim. A family friend, a former federal marshal, said he tracked the brothers to a remote Brazilian farm in the early 2000s. He didn't confront them, just observed from a distance. They looked old, peaceful, like men who knew they'd already won. These weren't fringe theorists. They were people who'd grown up with the Anglins, who knew their voices, their mannerisms, their grit, and they believed. In 2022, the U.S. Marshals released age-progressed renderings of the escapees, how they might look today. An official case, long considered dormant, was still open, which begs the question, why spend time and resources updating faces, unless someone still believes they're out there? For decades, the official stance was simple. They drowned. That was the line. That was the legend. The currents of San Francisco Bay, frigid, chaotic, merciless, would have pulled any swimmer under within minutes. No bodies meant no survivors. Case closed. Except science wasn't ready to let it go. In 2014, over 50 years after the escape, a group of Dutch researchers at Delft University of Technology decided to do something that the FBI and U.S. Marshals had never done: test the theory with math. They didn't rely on guesses or grainy footage. They built a full-scale hydrodynamic simulation of the San Francisco Bay, inputting 1962 tidal data, water temperatures, wind conditions, and even debris patterns. Every current, eddy, and undertow was reconstructed. Then they recreated the exact timing of the escape, around 11:30 p.m. on June 11, 1962. What they found stunned everyone. If the men had launched the raft between 11 p.m. and midnight, the tides would have actually helped them, carrying them straight toward Angel Island, and from there to the Marin Headlands. It was not only possible, it was likely. But if they had launched even an hour later, the current would have pulled them out toward the open Pacific, a death sentence. So the entire mystery hinged on a single hour, a window so narrow it was barely visible on paper. And yet, it lined up perfectly with what Alan West had said in his testimony decades earlier, that the men had exited their cells between 10:30 and 11 p.m. and were gone before the first light hit the water. Suddenly, what was once considered suicide began to look like strategy. This wasn't blind luck. The escapees had watched the tides. They'd timed their run to the minute, and the debris recovered. A paddle, a wallet, pieces of the raft had all been found within the projected path of the simulated drift pattern. Even more shocking, the simulation showed they could have reached Angel Island, walked inland unseen, and vanished into the cliffs, all before the morning head count even noticed they were gone. Which raises the real question. If science says they made it, and the government never found bodies, and the family says they were alive, what exactly is stopping us from saying they won? After the simulation, former U.S. Marshal Michael Dyke admitted something publicly for the first time. They could have made it, and if they did, they didn't make mistakes after that. Think about that. If Morris and the Anglins lived, they didn't just escape Alcatraz, they escaped history. No credit cards, no social media, no arrests, no headlines. They just slipped out of the most secure prison in the country and stayed gone for 60 years. And now with title charts, forensic reconstructions, and the cold logic of computer models all pointing in one direction, the myth is shifting, not toward conspiracy, but toward confirmation. If Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers did survive that night, if they made it across the bay, disappeared into South America, and lived out their days in silence, then the real question isn't how they did it. It's why they never came back. There was no fame, no fortune, no interviews, no books or documentaries, or deathbed confessions. Just a letter, maybe real, maybe not, and a blurry photo of two men standing beside a shack in Brazil. For three men who pulled off what was arguably the greatest prison escape in American history, they never once tried to claim credit. Why? For them, freedom wasn't about being seen. It was about being gone. Let's put this in perspective. Frank Morris was orphaned at 11. He was institutionalized before he ever learned how to dream. His childhood wasn't freedom. It was just a hallway between different kinds of cages. The Anglin brothers were dirt-poor farm kids, picking crops from sunrise to dusk, then robbing banks just to survive. Alcatraz didn't just take their bodies. It took their names, their identities. They were known only by numbers, fed through steel grates, and stared down by gun towers every day of their lives. So maybe escape wasn't about proving anything. Maybe it was just the first time they got to decide what happened next. No more cages, no more counting, just anonymity. And maybe they realized something most of us never do, that the loudest kind of freedom is the kind that never needs to be declared. There's a certain irony here. Had they been caught, they would have become legends. But by vanishing, truly vanishing, they became something else. A ghost story that even the US government couldn't kill. And maybe that was the point. By never confirming their fate, they turned their absence into a kind of protest. Against the system, against punishment without rehabilitation, against the myth of the unbreakable rock. They cracked it, then they let the silence echo. To this day, the official record calls the men missing, presumed drowned. But the case is still open. The US Marshals still have it on file. Age-progressed images are still being updated. And somewhere in a small town or hidden valley, someone might still be walking around with a name that isn't theirs, and a story they'll never tell. Because for some people, freedom isn't about proving you escaped. It's about never giving anyone the satisfaction of catching you. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers didn't just escape a prison, they escaped history. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.